So my name is Pablo. I do a bunch of different kinds of work. And I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about what the process has been, throughout my career to kind of get to where I'm at now, and how kind of starting to kind of full circle in a way. So I started out in high school wanting very, very badly to be a comic book penciler. And that's all I did, and that's all I wanted to do. And when it came time to go to college, I went to art school for illustration at a school in Florida. And unfortunately, there's really not a lot of things to do on the western coast of Florida. You can either do drugs or you can do homework. And if you're a college kid, you're gonna do the drugs. So that didn't work out too well for me. After about 2 years, I ended up back home in Puerto Rico with no degree and very little idea of what I should do. I mean, I'd been studying illustration for 2 years, so I figured I'd give that a shot. Needless to say, the market for a freelance illustrator in Puerto Rico was there, but certainly not enough for me to pay the bills. At one point, I remember going to one of the largest circulation magazines in the city, and basically they were like, "Yeah, sure, give us a full color, full page illustration. I'll give you $80 for it." I'm like, "Are you crazy?" So I started kind of pounding the pavement, and I fell into advertising. I kind of fell into working as an art director, as an assistant junior, or whatever you call it, art director, at J. Walter Thompson. And I discovered it was a wonderful experience in many, many ways. I met some wonderful people who I still consider great friends. I also really kind of started getting the idea that this whole notion of going off and doing your own thing and being a freelancer and working for yourself right out of college is a really bad idea. You learn craft, you learn to take care of your work, you learn to critique, you learn to iterate much more on the job working with other people than you would just doing it on your own, especially out of school. You learn how to present. You learn how to talk to clients, you learn how to pitch an idea and sell it. And these aren't things that necessarily they teach you at school. So for me, my school with regards to that kind of thing was very much the advertising agencies. And there was a big, big emphasis on, on owning your work and getting up there in front of a client and justifying your decisions and really having a solid rationale, but at the same time being open to criticism. And again, as I mentioned in the panel, being able to distinguish between what's, for example, a client being ignorant and not really knowing what they're talking about, and what's actually valid criticism that you should take to heart and act upon. So that was really, really valuable. In the meantime, I started realizing that, and I'm not sure if it's the case up here as much, but in a very real sense, advertising in Puerto Rico and to an extent in Latin America is kind of the go-to day job for creatives. Many of the art directors that I collaborated with or I worked with had and still have obviously careers in the visual arts, gallery shows and things like that. A lot of the people who were in production or who worked at the film studios, were musicians or were in bands or had their own, filmmaking concerns and whatnot. And I realized, it doesn't have to be this, kind of dichotomy of us versus them or whatever. You can use these big companies and you can kind of, work within that system to subsidize, the work that you're doing on the side and keep that going. But, eventually, as you said, working towards the day where that sideline becomes your day job. But it doesn't have to be, you don't have to play into that that cliche of like the starving artist of, oh, woe is me, I can't, nobody understands my work, I can't make a living off of my work. You know what? There are outlets for it, and you just have to understand that what you're doing is a craft and what you're doing is a job. And sometimes you're going to be doing it for yourself, and sometimes you're going to be doing it for others for money. And that's how you pay the rent. So I was in advertising for about 6 or 7 years, and it was a really, really educational time in my life. It happened to be during the beginning of the 2000s when the means of production for media were becoming truly democratized, when Final Cut first came into its own, when people were actually starting to make websites at a commercial level and things like that. It happened a little bit later in Puerto Rico, but that's when it was happening. And I went through a period of about 4 or 5 years where, after working at a couple of large agencies, J. Walter and Lo Lintas and a couple of others, I went into work in this small studio with this friend of mine, and it was literally 3 or 4 of us, and we were literally kind of making it up as we went along. And I literally learned how to create a website with HTML over a weekend because one of our suppliers crapped out on us and left us holding the bag for a client that we designed a website and we had this guy code it. He crapped out, so I had to kind of figure that out, and that kind of bootstrapped me into learning how to code. We found ourselves in a situation where we could pitch shooting commercials, so we had to figure out how to put together a Final Cut system in our studio, and how to hire the right DPs and have the right equipment and then editing and all that stuff. So we kind of built all that stuff from the ground up, and it was an incredibly learning experience. To this day, I have a frame of reference that's very broad, and throughout many of the media arts, because I may not be an expert in them, but I did put these things together and kind of was in there at the ground floor, and I can speak the language. The other thing that really helped me out a lot was due to the fact that a lot of creatives have their day job in the advertising industry. You learn a lot. Oh, okay. You learn a lot. So you learn about direction, you learn about music, you learn about editing, compositing, all this great stuff. And after about 7 years, I kind of got really tired of working in advertising. And I went back to school, and that's when I moved up to New York. And I went back to school for design. I figured, that was a good path for me. And that's what I've been doing. And while I was in school, I discovered book arts, and I discovered that I love making hand bound books, and I love making silk screens, and I love printing in that process. And I figured I'd kind of parlay that into a career in publishing. And I applied for a job as a cover designer at a large publishing house. Again, kind of that whole, money-making job during the day, doing my own stuff at night kind of deal. And I fell in at Tor Books, where I then, about a year and a half into the job, Tor Books started up this website, and they needed someone. It was a blog, and they needed someone to run it who knew about blogs and things like that. So this was like in 2006 or 2007. So they tapped me to do it, and then my career kind of took on a completely different turn. Now I wasn't so much focused on design; it was focused on production and on publishing on the web and curation and editorial work. But always with that kind of undercurrent of keeping design and keeping the visual very front and foremost. And I learned about publishing systems, and I learned, I'd already had a rudimentary background in code, so I could kind of speak with developers and kind of tell them what we needed and all that stuff. And that kind of parlayed into the other few jobs that I've had since then, which have also been managing technology for publishing companies. And over the last few years in particular, I've kind of, over the years, I've kind of moved away from the whole comics thing, always kind of stay in the background, and at one point, inevitably, you hit your 20s and you're broke and you can't afford to spend, $40 on comics every week, so you kind of drop the habit, and, you kind of come back to it, and you're like, oh wow, it's in the same place, and, all these great characters, they seem so stale now because they're telling the same stories. But you're still in love with the art form, and you're still in love with the medium, and it's what you were saying about animation as well, Stephen. You know, it's not a genre. It's a medium. It's a storytelling, you know, conveyance. It's not superheroes and underwear perverts, as Warren Ellis calls them. So you start thinking about these things, and I started thinking about these experiences that I've had, you know, working with technology and working with designers in the digital space, and trying to figure out how that could be applied to comics. And about a year ago now, maybe a little bit more, I started kind of fooling around with comics built out of HTML. And that basically means, you know, you don't have a static page, you have a page that's composed of different pieces, which by using techniques in responsive design, you can adapt to look differently under different contexts. So about a year ago, I put together this proof of concept based off of a story by my friend Tobias Mikkel, who's one of the artists that I collaborate with, and it's essentially, you know, the first page or so of one of his novels, Sly Mongoose, and you know, this is the first page, and then this is the second page. There's no pagination here yet, and it's just a very simple 2-page story. But the fun begins when you start to change around the orientation on these things. So you start seeing that the layout changes, you know, and the layout changes to adapt to the context that it's in. So, you know, if it's in landscape mode, it looks this way. If it's in portrait mode, it's going to look, you know, it's going to look appropriate for portrait mode. And then it gets even funkier when you pull it up on the phone, because the phone is obviously a smaller screen. Let me actually just, this is all online, so I need to pull up the website there. There we go. And I'm going to pull up the camera so you can see it on the projector. So it's loading. There we go. So, you know, it's the same comic, but it's, you know, it's adapted to this particular.
Yeah, that's cool.
This particular is a little funky. I need to reload it actually.
That's cool.
So it's taking these disparate worlds, which is, you know, the world of graphic storytelling and then the world of technology, and just marrying them and taking advantage of the technology that's out there. That's what I wanted to show you guys. So you know, it's kind of turned into this very, I joke around, I kind of say that I'm trying to channel, you know, the cliches of Steve Jobs. It's taking that kind of like, you know, the liberal arts and the technology and marrying them together and making something better out of it. And you know, that's the first iteration that was presented. That was presented some months back, and I'm now working on a follow-up with more complicated, you know, layouts and things like that. But it's very much, it feels very much like I've gone full circle. You know, like I've gone through this whole process of learning all these technologies and learning all these media and learning all these different things, and then applying them back to my first love, which is comics.
Can you clarify what we were looking at? Were you opening an app
page.
That it was a web page, so it was through.
You can load it
we
on
were
your
looking at it through a
iPad.
browser on different
Yeah.
devices, and it was responsive.
Yeah. Yeah, you can load it up on your site. It's defendini.com/bib. And you know, that's part of it. It's part of making things accessible, as opposed to, you know, like I work in publishing, so a lot of what I work with are publishing systems, and you know, I deal with silos a lot, or siloed content, and you know, you're publishing for iBooks, or you're publishing for Amazon, or you know, that's as a creator, that's very annoying. You know, it's like you're making an animated short, and you know, if you're going to show it, you know, on YouTube, you'd have to use this software. You have to use Final Cut to edit it, as opposed to if you're showing it on Vimeo, you'd have to use, After Effects. And there are two different pipelines and two different processes. And that's the state of ebook development right now. If you're doing something for iBooks for everybody, you're doing it one way. Then if you're doing it for Amazon, you're doing it in another way. It's very frustrating. So that kind of naturally leads me to find solutions that are based on universal technology, like the web stack. So you're using HTML and CSS, and you know that anybody who's got a browser, within reason, because different browsers show things differently, you know that they're all going to be able to see the same thing. And you don't have to freak out about, oh, it's finished and it looks wonderful as an iBook, but now I have to figure out why it looks like shit on Amazon. And it's one of the big frustrations that I'm trying to address, with cons.
But you're making those choices, you're sort of designing three different, we looked at three different things, basically. You made three different design choices for that.
Yep,
Yeah.
and that's the other side of it, which is what I'm talking about a lot with the artists that I'm working on. Like, these were my own sketches, and I'm a perfectly adequate draftsman, but I'm working with an artist to get some really good artwork out there. It's one of the things that I'm working with him is I'm explaining to him, and he happens to be my best friend, so we kind of understand each other very much in this way. It is more work for the artist. You're basically telling him, tell the story 5 different ways, in so many words. But it's also really interesting the way that process, and the way, again, it speaks to that iteration that you were talking about earlier. Yeah, we've got the phone layout knocked out. Awesome, great. Let's move on to the small tablet layout, for example. That's great. Then we move on to the big tablet layout. Oh, wait a minute, that's not working. Okay, so how do we change that? Oh, that's a really cool solution for the iPad. But then how would that translate on the phone? And that actually, so it all kind of, it bakes in a level of iteration that wasn't there before, and it kind of generally bootstraps the work into being better. It's slow going because it's moonlighting work, and he works days as well, but we've had a couple of moments where we've kind of gone back to square one, where we reach a point maybe on like page 6 or 7 where we're like, oh shit, okay, so this is really interesting. This really interesting transition or layout that happened here is something that we could apply, thematically throughout the whole thing. So let's go back and let's apply that kind of stuff. And that process of exploration is really interesting. So while it is more work, in general, it also allows for much more exploration and much more iteration.
Is there something similar for video where the responsive design is giving you different version of the video, or different, do you know what I'm saying, in terms of like seeing it big and seeing it small?
You can do, it's not video per se, but you can do a lot with CSS transitions. For example, there's a video online which is actually not a video. It's HTML and CSS, which has mimicked to the T the intro to Mathman, for example. So like that piece of motion graphics has been replicated in HTML and CSS. So once you have it in HTML and CSS, you can apply responsive techniques to it and kind of create, different transitions and different layouts for different contexts. But it's not video per se, because video is a static, it's a static dimension.
Thank you so much.